Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with a quiet knock after midnight. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Ethan Brooks had just finished washing the grease from his hands in the tiny kitchen sink of his weathered farmhouse outside Ashford, Montana. The old clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily while the house settled into the peaceful silence that always came after his 10-year-old daughter, Emily, had fallen asleep. It had been another ordinary Wednesday. 8 customer vehicles, 1 broken hydraulic jack, 2 skipped meals, and 1 elderly woman whose aging blue Buick had refused to start on a lonely stretch of county road nearly 20 miles outside town. Ethan never asked her for money. He never asked who she was. He simply rolled up his sleeves beneath the fading evening sun, diagnosed the failing alternator, searched through the spare parts stacked inside his pickup truck, and spent nearly 2 hours bringing the old sedan back to life. When the grateful woman reached into her purse, Ethan smiled politely and gently shook his head. "Save it for something that makes you smile," he had told her before climbing back into his truck. That was supposed to be the end of the story. But life had a strange way of remembering kindness long after the person offering it had forgotten. Ethan dried his hands with a faded shop towel and quietly checked on Emily before heading toward the front porch to lock the screen door for the night. The cool Montana air drifted through the pine trees surrounding the property, carrying the familiar scent of fresh earth and distant rain. Then headlights appeared. At first, Ethan assumed someone had taken the wrong road. Few people ever drove this far into the countryside after dark. But one pair of headlights became 3, then 5, then 7, each moving slowly along the gravel driveway until an entire line of black luxury SUVs came to a graceful stop in front of his modest home. Their polished paint reflected the porch light, while expensive engines settled into silence. Ethan stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the wooden porch railing, his expression calm, yet unmistakably puzzled. Several men and women wearing tailored business attire stepped from the vehicles, respectfully remaining several yards away instead of approaching. None of them spoke. Finally, the rear passenger door of the first SUV opened. A tall blonde woman wearing a beautifully tailored camel coat stepped onto the gravel with quiet confidence. Her posture reflected years of leadership, yet there was something unexpectedly gentle in her eyes as she slowly walked toward the porch. Ethan had never seen her before, yet she looked strangely familiar from television interviews displayed occasionally on the waiting room television inside his garage. She stopped several feet away, offering a respectful smile instead of authority. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the pine branches while porch light illuminated the contrast between a billionaire's polished elegance and a mechanic's worn work clothes. Then the woman finally broke the silence. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "my name is Claire Kensington. I believe you met my grandmother this afternoon." Ethan searched her face, remembering the elderly woman with warm eyes and the old blue Buick. Claire drew a careful breath before continuing. "She told me everything. I came here tonight because there are some debts money can never repay, and I needed to meet the man who reminded my family what genuine kindness still looks like." Claire Kensington remained quietly at the foot of the porch steps, allowing the silence to settle naturally instead of rushing to fill it with explanations. Ethan Brooks looked beyond her toward the long row of dark sport utility vehicles resting beneath the towering pine trees, then back to the woman standing before him. Nothing about the moment felt ordinary, yet nothing about Claire suggested arrogance. She carried herself with quiet confidence rather than superiority, and that alone made Ethan lower his guard. "I think you have the wrong impression of me," he said gently. "I only fixed a car." Claire smiled softly. "That is exactly what my grandmother said you would say." Ethan opened the screen door just enough to glance down the hallway toward Emily's bedroom. The house remained peaceful. Satisfied that his daughter was still asleep, he stepped back onto the porch and quietly closed the door behind him. "She is resting," he explained. "I try not to wake her unless I absolutely have to." Claire nodded with understanding. "My grandmother told me about your little girl. She also told me you refused every dollar she offered." Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his worn jeans. She looked like someone who deserved a little help. That was enough. One of Claire's assistants carefully approached, carrying a leather envelope before stopping several feet away. Claire accepted it, but did not immediately hand it to Ethan. Instead, she looked around the modest farmhouse, noticing the weathered porch swing, the old rocking chair with fresh wood repairs, and flower boxes that had clearly been built by hand. Nothing appeared expensive, yet everything reflected patience and care. "May I ask you something?" Claire said. Ethan nodded. "Why did you stop?" You had already driven past her. Ethan smiled as though the answer required no thought at all. "Because someday I hope someone stops for my daughter if she ever needs help." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment. The words landed more deeply than she expected. Throughout her career, she had listened to billion-dollar presentations, complicated negotiations, and polished speeches from world-class executives. Somehow that single sentence carried more weight than all of them. She slowly opened the envelope and removed a certified check before extending it toward Ethan. "Please accept this. It will not change what you did, but it would mean a great deal to my grandmother." Ethan barely glanced at the amount before gently pushing the check back toward Claire. "I cannot accept money for doing what my father taught me was simply the right thing." Claire looked genuinely surprised. Most people would not refuse this. Ethan answered calmly, "Maybe, but then it would feel like I fixed her car because I expected something in return. That is not the story I want my daughter to remember." At that very moment, the front door opened quietly behind him. Emily stood barefoot in the hallway wearing blue pajamas and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "is everything all right?" Ethan immediately smiled. "Everything is fine, sweetheart." Claire's expression softened as Emily stepped onto the porch beside her father. The little girl politely waved before hiding slightly behind Ethan's arm. Claire knelt just enough to meet her at eye level without making her uncomfortable. "You must be Emily," she said warmly. Emily nodded. "My dad helps everybody," she replied with complete confidence. "He says broken things deserve another chance." Claire felt her heart grow unexpectedly quiet. She realized she had driven nearly 200 miles believing she had come to thank a mechanic. Standing beneath the porch light, listening to a little girl describe her father with simple certainty, she understood she had actually come to meet a man whose quiet dignity had already begun changing lives long before anyone powerful had ever learned his name. Claire Kensington did not try to persuade Ethan Brooks again. Instead, she carefully folded the certified check, placed it back inside the envelope, and handed it to one of her assistants without another word. For the first time in many years, she realized that respect could not be purchased and gratitude did not always arrive in the form of financial reward. She looked at Ethan and Emily standing together beneath the warm porch light and understood why her grandmother had sounded unusually emotional during their evening phone call. The quiet strength of that small family could be felt without anyone needing to explain it. Claire smiled warmly at Emily before saying, "Your father has given my family something far more valuable than a repaired car." Emily tilted her head with innocent curiosity. "He only fixed the part that was broken," she answered softly. Ethan gently rested his hand on his daughter's shoulder, smiling with quiet pride rather than embarrassment. Claire thanked them both once more before returning to the waiting vehicle. As the line of luxury sport utility vehicles slowly disappeared down the gravel road, silence returned to the farmhouse just as naturally as it had been interrupted. Ethan locked the front door, tucked Emily back into bed, and quietly prepared for another ordinary morning, believing the unexpected visit had simply become another unusual memory that would soon fade away. Yet while the farmhouse settled into peaceful darkness, Claire's evening had only begun. During the 2-hour drive back toward Billings, she never opened the tablet resting beside her. Instead, she stared through the window as pine forests gave way to wide Montana valleys beneath the moonlight. Every few miles, she found herself remembering another detail from Ethan's home: the repaired rocking chair, the neatly stacked firewood, the carefully maintained flower boxes, the simple kitchen where nothing was luxurious, but everything reflected patience, responsibility, and love. She had spent years studying balance sheets, market forecasts, and corporate performance reports. Yet somehow a modest farmhouse had revealed more about lasting success than any executive conference she had ever attended. Shortly after midnight, she finally spoke. "Thomas," she said to the driver, "tomorrow morning, I want everything we can legally obtain about Ethan Brooks and Carter Auto Repair." Thomas briefly looked into the rearview mirror. "Background verification?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No, I am not looking for mistakes. I want to understand who he really is." Early the following morning, while Ethan opened the garage door at Carter Auto Repair and welcomed his first customer with the same easy smile he offered everyone, Claire entered the top floor of Harrington Industries. Her assistants quietly delivered several folders to her office before the first meeting of the day. The reports confirmed that Ethan had owned the small repair shop for nearly 12 years, had never missed a local business tax payment, had sponsored youth baseball teams whenever he could afford it, and regularly repaired vehicles for elderly residents at little or no charge. There were no headlines celebrating him, no awards hanging on his office wall, and no social media campaigns documenting his generosity. His kindness existed simply because he believed it should. Claire closed the final folder and remained seated in thoughtful silence. Looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, she realized something that surprised even her. She had spent years searching for exceptional leaders inside conference rooms, investment firms, and executive retreats, yet the most remarkable example of character she had encountered all year was a mechanic in a faded flannel shirt who believed that doing the right thing required no audience at all. The following afternoon, Claire Kensington stepped into the executive boardroom overlooking downtown Billings, where floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a bright Montana sky across polished glass and dark walnut conference tables. Every chair around the room was occupied long before the meeting officially began. Senior executives quietly reviewed financial reports while legal advisors organized documents into careful stacks. The atmosphere carried the familiar confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet Claire noticed something different within herself. The numbers on the presentation screen remained exactly the same as they had been the previous week, but she no longer viewed them through the same eyes. As the meeting began, Richard Coleman calmly stood and activated the first presentation. Charts, forecasts, and production analyses appeared one after another. "The Ashford manufacturing facility continues to underperform," Richard explained with professional composure. "Closing operations before the fourth quarter would improve long-term profitability and satisfy investor expectations." Several directors nodded in agreement while quietly making notes. Claire listened without interruption, her hands resting calmly on the conference table. Richard continued outlining projected savings, operational efficiencies, and future expansion opportunities in larger metropolitan areas. Every recommendation appeared logical on paper. Every calculation was accurate. Yet Claire found herself thinking not about spreadsheets, but about a weathered farmhouse surrounded by pine trees, a little girl speaking proudly about her father, and a mechanic who believed that kindness should never come with a price tag. When Richard finished, silence settled across the room. All eyes turned toward Claire, expecting a routine approval. Instead, she slowly closed the financial folder before her. "Before we vote," she said evenly, "I would like to ask everyone a question." The directors exchanged curious glances. Claire continued, "How many families depend directly on the Ashford facility for their livelihood?" One executive answered immediately. "Approximately 1,100 employees, not including local suppliers." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "And how many communities would feel the impact if those jobs disappeared?" No one answered immediately. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard finally responded, "That is unfortunate, but our responsibility is to protect the company." Claire looked directly at him without anger. "I believe our responsibility is larger than that." Richard maintained his professional tone. "With respect, emotions cannot determine corporate strategy." Claire offered a calm smile. "I agree. Neither should numbers without understanding the people behind them." The room remained silent as she stood and slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Yesterday, I met someone who owns almost nothing by the standards represented in this room, she said quietly. Yet he possesses something many successful people spend their entire lives searching for. He has earned the trust of his community without asking for recognition. He helps because it is right, not because it benefits him. That kind of character reminded me that leadership is measured not only by quarterly reports, but also by the lives we influence through our decisions. Richard respectfully folded his hands. Are you suggesting we ignore financial reality? Claire turned back toward the table. No, I am suggesting we examine every possible alternative before asking 1,100 families to carry the weight of our convenience. She paused briefly before adding, postpone the final vote for 48 hours. I want a complete modernization proposal for the Ashford facility, including every realistic option that preserves both long-term sustainability and local employment. Surprise spread quietly across the room. Several directors immediately began reviewing their notes, while others exchanged thoughtful glances. Richard did not argue further, but his expression revealed careful skepticism. Claire resumed her seat with the same calm confidence she had carried into the meeting. Deep inside, she realized the conversation had never truly been about a factory. It had begun the previous evening beneath a simple porch light, where one ordinary mechanic had quietly reminded her that the strongest foundations are built not only with steel and investment, but with integrity that refuses to disappear when nobody is watching. 48 hours felt surprisingly short when every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives. While consultants assembled reports and executives revised projections inside Harrington Industries, Ethan Brooks continued living exactly as he always had. Long before sunrise, he unlocked Carter Auto Repair, switched on the aging lights above the service bays, and greeted his first customer with the same warm smile that had become as dependable as the old clock hanging above his workbench. News about corporate meetings never reached his garage. His attention remained fixed on engines, customers, and the promise he had made to Emily years earlier that no matter how difficult life became, she would always come home to a father who kept his word. Late that Friday afternoon, as golden sunlight stretched across the parking lot, a familiar black sport utility vehicle quietly rolled to a stop outside the garage. Claire Kensington stepped out alone, dressed far more casually than during her midnight visit, wearing dark blue jeans, comfortable brown boots, and a simple light sweater beneath a tailored jacket. There were no assistants, no photographers, and no executives accompanying her. Ethan looked up from replacing brake pads on an aging pickup truck and smiled politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "You are back." Claire returned the smile. "I hope I am not interrupting." Ethan removed his work gloves and shook his head. "Around here, everyone gets a turn. Yours just happens to come after a Ford pickup." Both of them laughed softly, and the conversation immediately felt natural instead of formal. After finishing the repair and thanking the customer, Ethan invited Claire to sit on the weathered wooden bench outside the garage while fresh coffee brewed inside the small office. The quiet hum of distant traffic mixed with birdsong drifting through the crisp Montana air. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Claire watched local residents wave to Ethan as they drove past, each receiving the same friendly wave in return. "Does everyone know you?" she finally asked. Ethan shrugged with a modest smile. "Small towns remember people who stay." Claire looked down at the warm coffee cup resting in her hands. "I came because I need your advice." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Mean it?" She nodded slowly. "I have a decision to make that will affect many families. Every report gives me one answer. Something inside me keeps asking another question." Ethan remained quiet, allowing her to continue. "How do you know when the difficult choice is also the right one?" He looked toward the open garage where sunlight reflected across neatly organized tools before answering. "My father used to rebuild old engines with me when I was a kid." Claire listened carefully. "Whenever I wanted to replace a part because it looked worn, he would stop me. He always said, 'Never throw away something that can still be restored. It takes less character to replace than it does to repair.'" Claire remained silent. Ethan continued gently. "People are not much different. Businesses are not either. Sometimes rebuilding takes longer. Sometimes it costs more. But if you only choose what is easy, eventually people stop believing you care about anything except convenience. The words settled quietly between them. There was no dramatic speech, no attempt to persuade. Only a simple lesson passed from one generation to the next. Claire smiled with grateful eyes. "You know," she said softly, "you never actually told me what decision to make." Ethan chuckled. "That is because it is your decision. If someone else chooses for you, you will never truly own the outcome." Claire slowly stood, feeling lighter than when she had arrived. As she walked toward her vehicle, she glanced back once more at Ethan, already returning to the pickup truck waiting inside the garage. He had no idea that the quiet conversation they had just shared would soon influence one of the most important decisions in her career and perhaps the future of an entire Montana community. Monday morning arrived beneath a clear Montana sky as the executive boardroom at Harrington Industries filled once again with quiet conversation, neatly organized reports, and the familiar confidence of experienced leaders preparing to make a decision that would shape the future of an entire community. Claire Kensington entered precisely on time, greeting every director with the same calm professionalism she had always displayed, yet something within her had become unmistakably stronger. She no longer carried uncertainty. She carried conviction. Richard Coleman sat across the polished conference table reviewing the final financial projections prepared during the previous 48 hours. Every page still pointed toward the quickest path to higher profits, but another report now rested beside them, outlining a comprehensive modernization plan for the Ashford manufacturing facility. As the meeting officially began, the room settled into complete silence. Claire stood beside the presentation screen and thanked every department for completing such extensive work in such a short period of time. She carefully reviewed both proposals without favoring either one, allowing every director to ask questions and express concerns. Richard spoke first. "The modernization plan requires patience, additional investment, and measurable risk. Closing the facility remains the safer financial decision." Several directors quietly nodded while others waited for Claire's response. She acknowledged Richard with genuine respect before speaking. "You are correct that rebuilding requires greater commitment. The numbers make that perfectly clear." She paused only briefly before continuing. "What the numbers cannot fully measure is trust. Communities remember whether we stood beside them when circumstances became difficult. Employees remember whether we viewed them as partners or simply as expenses. That trust becomes part of the foundation upon which every successful company is built." The room remained still as every person listened. Claire advanced to the next presentation slide, displaying detailed engineering plans, workforce training programs, updated production equipment, and long-term financial forecasts. "This proposal is not based on emotion," she explained calmly. "It is based on responsible investment, sustainable growth, and confidence that skilled people deserve the opportunity to succeed when given the proper tools." Richard carefully studied the revised projections before looking toward Claire once again. "You believe this approach will ultimately strengthen both the company and the community?" Claire answered without hesitation. "Edo." A thoughtful silence followed. One by one, other directors began asking practical questions instead of challenging the proposal itself. Engineers explained modernization timelines. Financial officers demonstrated projected returns over several years. Human resources leaders outlined employee development programs. Slowly, the atmosphere changed from opposition to collaboration. When the final vote was called, each director quietly marked a ballot before passing it forward. The corporate secretary counted every vote with careful precision before looking toward Claire. "The modernization proposal has been approved." No applause followed. Only a deep, respectful silence filled the room as everyone recognized the significance of what had just happened. Richard leaned back in his chair and offered a small, sincere smile. "I still believe it will be difficult," he admitted. "But I also believe you have chosen a path worth attempting." Claire nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Hundreds of miles away, Ethan Brooks knew nothing about the meeting that had just concluded. He spent the same morning replacing a worn water pump on an aging family sedan while Emily completed homework at the small desk inside the office. Customers continued arriving with ordinary problems, and Ethan continued solving them with the same patience that had defined every ordinary day before. He never imagined that a simple decision to help an elderly stranger beside a quiet Montana road had quietly echoed into a boardroom where powerful people chose restoration over convenience. Some victories announced themselves with celebration. Others began in complete silence, changing countless lives long before the people responsible ever realized the difference they have made. 3 weeks passed so quietly that Ethan Brooks barely noticed how much the world around him had begun to change. Every morning, he unlocked the front door of Carter Auto Repair before sunrise, switched on the workshop lights, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and welcomed each customer with the same patient smile that had always defined his little garage. Life remained comfortably ordinary. Emily continued riding the school bus every weekday, spending her afternoons finishing homework in the small office while her father repaired engines only a few yards away. The old golden retriever still slept beneath the workbench, and the familiar scent of motor oil, fresh coffee, and pine drifting through the open garage door made every day feel reassuringly familiar. Yet beyond the walls of the garage, Ashford itself was beginning to breathe differently. Construction crews arrived at the manufacturing facility before dawn each morning. New equipment rolled through the factory gates on flatbed trailers. Electricians, welders, engineers, and technicians worked side by side, preparing the aging plant for its next chapter instead of its final day. Local diners welcomed larger breakfast crowds. The grocery store stayed open later because more families were shopping again. Even the small hardware store across Main Street reported its strongest month in years. The town was slowly recovering, one ordinary day at a time. Ethan noticed the extra traffic, but simply assumed another local business had expanded. He never connected those changes to a quiet conversation shared over coffee on the wooden bench outside his garage. Meanwhile, Claire Kensington visited the factory almost every week. She walked the production floor wearing a hard hat, protective glasses, and practical work boots instead of expensive executive shoes. Rather than remaining inside conference rooms, she spoke directly with machinists, maintenance crews, supervisors, and new apprentices learning valuable skills. Every conversation reminded her why the decision had mattered. One afternoon, as she observed newly installed equipment being carefully tested, Richard Coleman quietly approached her. For several moments, they simply watched employees working together with focused determination. Finally, Richard smiled to himself before speaking. "I owe you something," he admitted. Claire looked at him with gentle curiosity. "You do?" Richard nodded. "An apology? I believed efficiency was always the highest form of leadership. I forgot that people are not numbers on a spreadsheet." Claire answered softly. "I almost forgot that once too." Richard looked across the busy factory floor, where experienced workers patiently trained younger employees. "You know," he continued thoughtfully, "I spent weeks trying to understand why you suddenly fought so hard for this place. I assumed someone had convinced you with financial projections that I had overlooked." Claire smiled warmly as memories returned of a weathered farmhouse, a little girl in blue pajamas, and a mechanic whose greatest lesson had never sounded like advice at all. "No," she replied quietly. "Someone simply reminded me what leadership looks like when nobody is watching." Richard followed her gaze across the bustling factory before asking one final question. "Does he know what happened?" Claire slowly shook her head. "Not yet." Richard smiled with quiet admiration. Maybe that is exactly why his example mattered so much. Hundreds of miles away, Ethan finished replacing a transmission on an aging family sport utility vehicle before wiping his hands with a clean shop towel. A grateful customer thanked him for another honest repair, and Ethan simply smiled before wishing the family a safe drive home. As evening sunlight settled gently across the mountains surrounding Ashford, he locked the garage for the day, never realizing that the greatest reward for his kindness had never been recognition. It was the unseen hope quietly returning to an entire town because one ordinary man had chosen to do the right thing when nobody expected anything from him. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies stretching across the Montana mountains as Carter Auto Repair welcomed another steady line of customers. Ethan Brooks rolled open the large garage door just after 7 o'clock, letting cool mountain air drift through the workshop while sunlight reflected from polished tools hanging neatly along the wall. Emily carefully arranged fresh wildflowers in a small mason jar on the office counter before settling down with a library book, smiling each time another familiar customer waved through the doorway. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a familiar vintage blue Buick slowly turned into the gravel parking lot. Ethan immediately recognized the elderly woman from the roadside several weeks earlier and walked toward the vehicle with the same welcoming smile he offered everyone else. Before he could say a word, the passenger door opened and Claire Kensington stepped out wearing simple blue jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a light cream-colored sweater. There were no security vehicles waiting behind her, no assistants carrying folders, and no executives standing nearby. Only Claire and her grandmother had come. "Good morning," Ethan said warmly. "It is nice to see both of you again." The elderly woman smiled as she accepted his gentle help stepping onto the gravel. This time, she laughed softly. "My car is working perfectly." Ethan smiled. "That is always good news for a mechanic." Claire looked around the familiar garage with quiet appreciation. The building seemed exactly as she remembered it, filled with honest work instead of expensive decorations. The old wooden bench remained beneath the shade tree outside. Wind gently moved the American flag hanging above the entrance while birds sang from nearby pine branches. Everything felt peaceful. Claire reached into a simple canvas bag and carefully removed a sealed envelope, not thick with financial documents but noticeably light. She handed it to Ethan. "This is for you," she said quietly. Ethan looked uncertain. "If this is another check, I cannot accept it." Claire smiled and slowly shook her head. "It is not money." Ethan opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter on elegant cream-colored stationery. He quietly began reading while complete silence settled around them. Claire had written about her grandmother's phone call that rainy evening, about driving through the night simply to thank a stranger, about standing inside the boardroom where one ordinary mechanic had unknowingly reshaped the thinking of an entire leadership team, and about discovering that genuine respect could never be purchased because it had to be earned through consistent character. The final lines were written in careful handwriting. "You reminded me that leadership begins long before someone receives a title. Thank you for helping me become a better person before becoming a better chief executive officer." Ethan finished reading and remained silent for several moments. Then he folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope, as though protecting something deeply valuable. "I do not know what to say," he admitted softly. Claire answered with a peaceful smile. "You do not have to say anything. I simply wanted you to know that your kindness mattered." Before Ethan could respond, another customer pulled into the parking lot with an older pickup truck making an unfamiliar engine noise. Ethan instinctively looked toward the arriving vehicle before turning back to Claire with an apologetic smile. "I should probably help them." Claire nodded immediately. "Of course you should." Ethan thanked both women for stopping by and walked toward the waiting customer with the same steady pace he had shown every day of his working life. Claire watched quietly as he greeted another complete stranger with warmth, patience, and genuine interest, behaving no differently than he had the day they first met. In that simple moment, she realized the greatest gift he had ever given the world was not repairing a single automobile. It was proving that extraordinary character is built through ordinary choices repeated every single day without expecting recognition in return. Several months passed, and spring quietly settled across Ashford, Montana, bringing fresh green hillsides, longer afternoons, and a renewed sense of optimism that seemed to touch every corner of the town. The factory that many people had once believed would close forever now operated with modern equipment, well-trained employees, and a confidence that reached far beyond production numbers. Families gathered again at local restaurants after work. Small businesses welcomed new customers. Children played in neighborhood parks, while parents spoke about the future with hope instead of uncertainty. Yet if someone had driven a few miles beyond Main Street to Carter Auto Repair, they would have found almost nothing had changed. Ethan Brooks still unlocked the garage before sunrise every morning. He still greeted every customer with the same warm smile. He still believed that every honest repair deserved his full attention, whether the vehicle was an aging farm truck or a family sedan with hundreds of thousands of miles on the odometer. Emily had grown taller over the past several months, and every afternoon after school she still completed her homework inside the small office before helping organize invoices or sweeping the waiting room floor. One bright Saturday morning, Ethan carefully climbed a wooden ladder above the garage entrance, carrying a handcrafted cedar sign he had spent several evenings carving by hand. After tightening the final screw, he climbed down and stepped back beside Emily to admire the finished work. The simple words carved into the wood read, "Integrity keeps the engine running." Emily smiled proudly. Grandpa would have loved that. Ethan looked at the sign for a long moment before quietly answering, "I hope I have lived in a way that would have made him proud." At that very moment, a familiar luxury sport utility vehicle slowly entered the gravel parking lot. Claire Kensington stepped out alone, dressed simply as she had during her previous visit, without any announcement or expectation of attention. She noticed the new sign immediately and smiled before walking toward the garage. "That seems to describe more than engines," she said warmly. Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe it does." Before either of them could continue the conversation, another customer arrived driving an older pickup truck that produced a steady rattling sound beneath the hood. Ethan instinctively turned toward the vehicle, offering the driver a welcoming wave. "Give me just a minute," he called kindly. Then he looked back at Claire with an apologetic smile. "Work never seems to slow down." Claire shook her head gently. "Please do not let me interrupt." Ethan thanked her with a nod and immediately walked toward the waiting customer, listening carefully as the man described the problem before opening the hood and beginning another ordinary repair. Claire remained quietly beside the garage for several minutes, watching the familiar rhythm unfold exactly as it always had. There was no special treatment because she was a billionaire. There was no attempt to impress her. Ethan simply continued serving the next person who needed his help, exactly as he had done on the roadside months before. Standing beneath the clear Montana sky, Claire finally understood that true greatness does not announce itself. It quietly reveals itself through countless ordinary choices made with honesty, humility, and compassion. She smiled one final time before returning to her vehicle, carrying with her a lesson that no business school, boardroom, or executive conference could ever teach. As Ethan finished another repair and watched another grateful customer drive safely home, he never considered himself extraordinary. He was simply a father keeping his promises, a mechanic doing honest work, and a neighbor choosing kindness whenever the opportunity appeared. Sometimes the world changes because powerful people make important decisions. Sometimes it changes because one ordinary person quietly refuses to stop doing the right thing. And in the end, that quiet dignity becomes the greatest legacy of all.